Dean. She has a PhD in special education from UCLA, and that's where she also completed her postdoctoral fellowship at the UCLA Center for Autism Research and Treatment. And her research interests include social development of children with disabilities at school, school-based intervention services for children with autism in economically disadvantaged communities, and the study of gender differences in the social behaviors of boys and girls with autism. And Michelle was a former special education teacher in LA Unified for many years. And I had the personal privilege of getting ready for today and getting to know Michelle and her really amazing story of and unique path on how she arrived to where she is in her career. And I'm just so excited for you guys to all hear about it and learn about Michelle and what brought her to her current place, and also about the really cool work that she's doing for our individuals on the autism spectrum. So welcome, Michelle.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yes. So I have some questions about you first before we jump into your work, just so we can all get to know you a little bit. So can you just tell us a little bit about you, where you live, where you work?
Okay. I live in Los Angeles. More specifically, I live in Culver City in Los Angeles. And I work at Cal State Channel Islands, which is about halfway between Los Angeles and Santa Barbara. And I'm an associate professor of special education at Cal State Channel Islands.
Very good. And how long have you been at Channel Islands?
I think this is my 7th year there.
Okay. For quite a while.
A while.
And can you just tell us how you ended up there at that school?
Yeah, well, I got my PhD and was looking for jobs. I really wanted a position in special education, teacher education, because that was my background. I also was married and my husband had an established career in Los Angeles. So I applied all over California, but I did get a position at Cal State Channel Islands, which meant that we didn't have to move out of Los Angeles. So that worked out perfectly.
Okay, so just to hear a little bit about what you're doing right now at Channel Islands and in the area, can you just tell us about some of your most recent work as it relates to social skills?
Yeah, actually, my colleague from Cal State LA, Julie Chang, and I just had a paper accepted into the journal Autism. We did a systematic review of social skills interventions, but we focused on school-based social skills interventions for children with autism who are included in the mainstream or general education setting. And we were particularly interested in looking at peer training, how folks are incorporating peer training into their intervention, and also live observation instruments. So how do researchers measure change or the effectiveness of interventions? What instrument tools do folks use? So that is in press right now, but really that systematic review of social skills in the mainstream setting, which is my area of interest in looking at how children with autism socialize with their typically developing peers. So I primarily focus on what's happening in the general education environment.
Okay, so just to ask you a little bit more about what you said you guys are studying is the social skills in the mainstream environment. So is that like an explicitly taught social skills program that you're monitoring, or are you just monitoring the social behaviors of the students in mainstream?
I think both. I mean, with social skills intervention, a lot of the evidence base is a result of interventions that occurred in the clinic setting. And we don't always see a generalization of skills from clinic-based social skills to the general education or to the applied or real life authentic setting. And so we really wanted to hone in and examine what sort of social interventions are being used in the inclusive setting for children with autism who are educated with their general education peers. And what we found was there was a pretty robust use of evidence-based practices. So that just supports the idea that not one intervention fits all, and we can use multiple different evidence-based practices to support the needs of kids. But then we also really wanted to look at how are people measuring change, and what variables are they looking at? Because what we want to see kids learning skills and actually using skills to mutually engage with a peer or peers in the authentic social setting at school, which school is the place where kids tend to make friends, and we want to help provide an environment so kids with autism can make and maintain friends with their peers.
Great. And when you were in the mainstream environment, when there was social skills being taught and using the evidence-based practices, which I'm thrilled to hear because that makes me think our work with Captain is effective, is getting out there. Was it primarily the general education teacher who was implementing it, or who did you see implementing those interventions?
That's a great question. It's primarily the researcher. And we noticed that there's a small amount of studies that are starting to build in staff training into the intervention condition, but that is the next step. So researchers go in, they implement the intervention, they go away, but that's difficult for sustainability. So thinking about how, when folks are developing social skills interventions, how do we make sure that there's this next piece with the staff training, so we can promote the intervention being used after the researchers leave.
Right, that makes sense. Wow, that's really cool work. Thank you for sharing that with us. And with regard to the social skills that you're studying, when I was reading about you and also hearing what you're saying, it sounds like it's primarily in schools. Is that where you've done all of your work, or have you also examined social skills in other contexts?
My focus tends to be school-based social interventions. So I really focus in on how kids are socializing with each other at school.
From like elementary all the way through 12th grade, or where have
yes.
you? Okay.
And yes, and I actually have done or been an intervention facilitator for first grade through 12th grade social skills interventions in school.
Okay, cool. Well, in a somewhat related but kind of different note, there has a secret I learned about you a few years ago is that in addition to your work at Channel Islands, that you also do some consulting work for shows down in the LA area. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the shows that you work with?
Yeah, right now, well, I've worked with, consulted on the show Atypical, which is Netflix and Sony, starting in season 1 and through season 4, which we're working on right now. And this is the last season of Atypical. And I've also done some consulting on a television show called Dead India, which is an animated series, again, on Netflix. And that should be coming out soon in this year. So primarily, I work with the writers to help develop characters, talk about things like, where would Sam Gardner, who is the lead character in Atypical, would he be in a special day class? Would he be in a general education setting? Would he have one-on-one support? That was season 1. In season 3, I might talk about, this is how college students apply for disability services. Here, parents cannot initiate disability services in higher education because we now have adults, or some kids like to distance themselves from their eligibility or once they get to university, so they sort of resist getting services. So I spent a lot of time working with the writers to help them understand what disability services is, how the laws change, how parents cannot get access, what sort of accommodations are common for individuals with autism. And then just within higher education, things like a note taker is really common, but the student who receives a note taker as an accommodation shouldn't necessarily know who that note taker is. So just sort of those nuances that if you want an authentic telling of a character's experience in university, then it's important to know the logistics of how do you get services and what does that actually look like in college.
Yeah. Well, as somebody who has watched Atypical, I haven't watched the Good India or Dead India, but having watched Atypical, I am struck by that show and some other films that it seems like there's more of a representation these days of diverse people. And can you tell us, is that something that you're passionate about, and reflecting different characters when you're doing consulting to represent people who might see the world or experience the world differently?
Yes, I'm very passionate about representation, and not just from the actors, but from writers, other consultants. And on Atypical, they also have an autistic self-advocate who would also review scripts. So my role was more around these systems of special education placements, perhaps what the therapist would say, or just weeding out jargon or making correct terms, correcting language. But in terms of the autistic experience, there was an autistic self-advocate who was consulting directly in that role as well. One thing that we really worked on from season 1 through season 4, if you see season 1, there's Sam Gardner. The actor is amazing, but he does not have autism. In season 2, you'll see that there is an autism social skills group. The characters in that social skills group are actors, professional actors who have autism. And as you see through season 3, that group gets more, the quality of their characters becomes more than kids with autism in a social skills group, and they actually get a more interesting storyline or story arc. And in 4, it's even better. So my goal is to see the entertainment industry create characters and who have autism, but they also have a really rich, meaningful storyline. So the event doesn't necessarily have to be autism. It could be this person has autism and they have the qualities and the traits of someone with autism, but they also get to have these really rich, meaningful parts, and they can participate and have relationships and have jobs, or depending on their developmental level and their age range. And we also want to increase the representation of individuals with autism on the set, in the writer's room. And right now, there's just an underrepresentation of individuals with autism proportionally within production companies. So that is a growing interest to me. And it's also something, after talking to folks in Hollywood recently, that is a growing interest in Hollywood as well, as to increase the involvement of individuals with autism in production.
I feel like, when you're talking, it just feels like this whole other world to me. It's super cool. You get like a high rating on the cool job factor. Can you tell us a little bit about like how you landed here? Because this is something that you hear about, like somebody just ran into a producer. Does that like really happen, or how did you end up on this track?
Well, I do have a very interesting career path. I don't have a traditional academic trajectory. So I have an undergraduate degree or bachelor degree in musical theater. I moved out to Los Angeles to act, which I did for maybe 6 months. And I realized I was so artsy and I head in the clouds that I figured I need to learn about this industry and business. So I decided I should work in casting, because that'd be a good way for me to understand that industry, especially from the point of view of an actor. And it was before the internet was a thing, and I bought this book of all the casting directors in town, and I made a cover letter and a resume, and I faxed it to every single casting director in Los Angeles, and someone actually hired me.
Wow.
I worked in casting, and then one job work begets work. So I kept working, and I was in casting for about 6 years. And then working in a casting office and just seeing, a stack of headshots this high for a one-line character made me completely lose interest in acting. And so after a while working in casting, I felt like maybe I needed to give a little bit more to society. I was also seeing that women over 50 didn't get as many jobs, so they were becoming more irrelevant, and I didn't love that either. And so I just followed the wind, and I joined a program called Teaching Fellows of Los Angeles, and I got accepted, and then I began teaching in a special day class in a middle school in South Central for kids with emotional disturbance. And that I completely shifted gears and went into teaching. And so once I went from there, I switched to an elementary school, and I got a class for students. At the time, it was called the High Functioning Autism Classroom. So all the kids with autism were fully included in the general education setting. And I loved it. And I loved working with the kids. And that really inspired me to then get a PhD. And so then I started at UCLA to get a PhD, working with Connie Kazari and studying social skills interventions in schools. So as I was getting my PhD and walking around my neighborhood, I used to walk my dog's best friend was another dog named Ozzy, and Ozzy's mom happened to be the creator of Atypical. And long before Atypical was a show, we used to talk about her dream, her spark of an idea of this show having this character looking for love, character with autism looking for love. And we would just sort of talk about what this character might be like. And so when Netflix finally bought the show, she offered me a job consulting on her show, which seemed like kismet to me. And somehow my very strange career path all of a sudden makes sense.
Wow, so it really does kind of happen. Like, I mean, you have a whole path that got you to where you were, but then at the end, like you have a friend with a dog that you guys walk together.
Our dogs were best buddies. Yes.
That's fascinating
how that worked out. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that there was that serendipitous meeting, because for people who haven't seen Atypical, I highly recommend it. I think it's entertaining for one, but also provides a really good representation of some of the individuals that we all seek to support. So what a story though. So you really made like a hard right turn from casting into like jumping into what some might see as one of the most intense teaching assignments in education.
Yes.
That must have felt a little awakening or surprising when you first got there.
I remember people in the entertainment industry used to ask me about that shift. And I said there's actually not much difference in the behaviors between some of the adults in the entertainment industry and the children in the classroom. It's just that the children don't necessarily know any better. But it was, and I've always really, really been interested in working in underserved communities. It's probably the way my experiences I had growing up. But to me, it seemed very boring to work in a middle-class neighborhood. I just and I still do feel this way. I feel very called to work in more underserved minority populations. I think there's really good work to be done, and I've had such wonderful experience working with families. So I still really, really believe in working in these communities.
Definitely. It's worthy work, definitely challenging at times, but agreed. And I think you hit on it, but just to reinforce, so how did that get you to really diving into social skills specifically and studying social skills specifically?
Yeah, so when I worked in this elementary school and I had the high functioning autism program, the students I had were on grade level academically. So my position was really to support behavior, executive functioning, and social skills. So I did traditional behavior modification and traditional pull-out lunch bunch sorts of social skills interventions. But it always sort of bugged me, or a little voice in my head said, why are we putting the onus of learning the skills solely on the individuals with autism, who by the nature of their diagnosis, this is an area of challenge for them.
Right.
Why don't we look more broadly at the whole class and teach social skills to everyone in the classroom, so we can have the typically developing kids meet the kids with autism halfway. Mm-hmm. So I built relationships with general education teachers, and I developed a curriculum. And sometimes I would develop curriculum for what's happening right now in the moment. And then sometimes it was more general lesson. But I would go in once a week into the general education class and teach a social skills lesson to everyone in the classroom, with the idea that everyone can be practicing skills to communicate with each other, because we oftentimes forget that we neurotypical people have a communication deficit as well. We need to learn how to speak and to communicate and to have this ongoing communication with a person with autism. And so that was really, the kids loved it, the teachers loved it. And then while I was doing this work, that's when Connie Kazari, who ended up being my advisor at UCLA, was doing a research study on social skills. And they were going to recruit participants, and I connected with one of her students at the time. And I realize now that I was quite a coup, because I just recruited all of my students for this study. And then I met Connie and I realized, I can go just study social skills? Really? I would love that. And so I applied and got accepted to her program.
Okay, interesting. Well, I think it's interesting that you bring that up, because when you said the part about the individuals in the casting world that are adults weren't all that different than the students you were serving, I often have that thought about social skills. Like sometimes after we do these intense interventions, I feel like the students we're supporting are nailing social skills, but then they go out into these environments and everybody else are making all these social errors, and then they're confused by that. So it's definitely needed. I think we can all relate to that in schools, and even, amongst all of our social circles that we roll in. Mm-hmm. And I also wanted to say that I forgot to say this in the beginning, but as we are rolling into questions from practitioners that are out there, if all of you who are listening out there have questions for Michelle as we're going, I am able to get those questions from Patty and Ann. So as you listen to us, we can ask those questions. And one's coming in right now, Michelle. Can you give some examples of some of the lessons that you have seen used in school settings in recess intervention?
Oh, okay. Well, I worked in a study with Connie Kazari's lab that was remaking recess intervention. And actually this would be available on her website, at the Kazari Lab website, information about the remaking recess intervention. It is an intervention that takes place on the playground, and we would train paraeducators or aides. We could also train teachers, but teachers tended not to be on the playground during recess. So we would teach a certain series of skills. One, scanning the playground to see the student who is isolated or experiencing social challenges. Facilitating some activity that student could be engaged with typically developing students. So we would either cue students, typically developing students who are close by, and saying, hey, why don't you go get that? Why don't you go get that kid on the playground and see, and pull them into the game. Or we would just start getting an exciting game started. And then as we're making sure everyone is getting a chance to learn how to play the game and play the game, then the facilitator will then, or the adult will then fade out and let the kids take over. So that is a very superficial summary of the intervention, but I see it's being posted in the chat, so that's great. So our idea is to teach paraprofessional skills, to identify kids with social challenges. We were focusing one-on-one on an adult with a child with autism, but ideally, in the real world, not every kid has an autism eligibility who's having social challenges. So we want to teach adults the skills to help all children, and then teach them to empower typically developing kids to think about how they can include kids in play. And also, quite simply, how do we have engaging games on the playground for all students? Because if you're in a small environment and all the boys are playing soccer on the playground, and there's one or two boys who don't like soccer, then we need to find another activity that is inclusive to those kids as well, and not just have this environment where someone is included because they don't particularly like that game.
Right.
So,
Was that challenging to identify games that were like both that were inclusive of all and different people's interests? I would think
it's actually not that challenging. But we did spend time making sure board games were brought out regularly.
Yeah.
I mean, board games is really a very simple way of creating a more inclusive environment for kids who don't necessarily like to play sports.
Mm-hmm.
But you need an adult who's responsible for board games, and just to make sure that these other types of play or engagement activities are brought out with every single day, so kids can depend on another form of engagement and control play.
And then I heard you saying teaching the paraprofessionals. Then were you also doing like a peer piece with that, where you were doing any like training to specific peers to help facilitate social interaction?
It wasn't necessarily peer training within that intervention, although in vivo or in the context, the person facilitating the intervention would, in the moment, train a peer either on the game or cue the peer. Can you go grab so-and-so and pull them into the game?
Yeah.
But it could easily, a peer mediated component could easily be added into that intervention.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and as we're talking about social skills, when I started in the beginning, I was talking about how you have specifically studied some of the differences across genders for individuals with autism. Can you tell us some of the key differences or the things that you have found in your research that are the differences?
Sure. Well, now that we're talking about the playground, some key differences in girls and boys with autism have to do with the environment and not as much about the actual kids. So girls and boys with autism tend to follow the same trends as typically developing boys and girls, in that girls like to hang out with girls and boys like to hang out with boys. And because of that, that means the social landscape is different for boys and girls. Boys, typically developing boys, tend to play games for a majority of the observation interval. And so if you're a boy and you don't like to play games, then it's pretty easy to detect your social challenges because you are simply not playing the game at school. Whereas girls, typically developing girls, they tend to be more fluid and flexible in their relationships. They flit from one activity to the next activity. But they maintain this mutual engagement with each other throughout the duration of the observation period or throughout the duration of recess. And when we think about female relationships, girls, we like chit chat, we gain intimacy through telling secrets. And these are things that if you have a social communication challenge, this can be particularly difficult for you. And if you're a girl with autism, girls with autism without intellectual disability are underrepresented, both in the research and then also tend to be diagnosed later or misdiagnosed. So these girls, if they are getting access to services, oftentimes this access to service is delayed due to under-recognition. But if they get access to services, things like social skills interventions, a girl with autism can be in a group with all boys. And so she never really gets a chance to practice the skills that are necessary to be successful in female relationships. And so, one characteristic within autism, similar to typically developing populations, is girls are more likely to be internalizers, boys are more likely to be externalizers. Girls can get overlooked because if you're quiet and compliant, then people will just accept, it's easier to be overlooked and ignored, and challenges might not be recognized. Whereas boys, if you're more likely to be externalizing, then certainly more likely to get a referral from your teachers for access to support and interventions. And so we know that girls do a better job of masking and hiding their symptoms of autism, but they have a hard time staying mutually engaged with a peer during recess. So that tells us that maybe the school has a hard time with identifying their social challenges, but their peers don't. And there seems to be some sort of social breakdown because these girls aren't able to stay mutually engaged with friends during recess.
And then is the manifestation of that with girls that do you end up seeing them like alone on the playground, or were you able to see kind of the long-term effects of that, not being able to hold that?
Well, that's interesting. It sort of crosses over to two different studies, but one in elementary school, what we saw is girls with autism looked like typically developing girls because they also were fluid in their movement on the playground, but rather than going from one jointly engaged group and one jointly engaged group, they would go from being joint engaged with a peer and then being solitary, being joint engaged with a peer and being solitary. And so this supports the camouflage hypothesis. And the camouflage hypothesis means that girls are better able to mask their symptoms of autism. And by masking, I mean they're mimicking or echoing the behaviors of others. So it could be scripting, it could be acting like they see other people act, but they don't, because they're copying or mimicking, they might not really understand the underlying motivation that is informing these behaviors. And so the social initiations or the conversations might seem a little awkward or quirky. And kids, I don't believe most kids are just good kids, but you think this is a hard person to have a conversation with, and this person isn't, so I'm just going to hang out with this person.
Right.
And also I've seen that we do things in groups. If we want to hang out in a group just naturally without any spoken language, all nonverbal communication, a neurotypical person shifts their behavior to conform to social group norms. And if I have a hard time interpreting nonverbal cues, like what girls do, an eye roll or a shared glance to the side, if I might have a difficult time shifting my behavior to conform to group norms. And that, if you don't know any better, that could come across as rude instead of just, I don't understand how to change my behavior in this situation. So that's what we found in the elementary school setting. And then what happens in the research is girls, adolescent girls and women tend to have high rates of comorbid mental health issues because of not being well supported and then having years of feeling very misunderstood and not being unsuccessful socially at school.
Yeah, so with that, is there, when you're running social skills group, I've personally experienced the same thing, just I think by like numbers alone, like you were talking about when we get candidates for social skills group, it's like 7 boys and 1 girl or something. And when you're doing that, it's very apparent that this is my experience, the girl in the room already like notices the difference and feels kind of uncomfortable. And then the issues that are brought up by the boys kind of dominate, which don't necessarily resonate with the girls. So have you, has there been any work done, or have you done social skills groups training or with just girls, having just girls in a group? And then is the content different because of that?
I haven't explicitly done school-based social skills groups focused on girls because oftentimes there's not many girls with autism in a general education setting. That said, I have analyzed social skills interventions where it just so happened that there was an all-girl group. And that can be really tricky with a general intervention just because the way girls socialize each other is really subtle, and without really being trained about the nuances in female conversations, a girl could be bullied to her face and it might not even be caught because we do things like, I saw 2nd grade girls do things like, and that is being rejected to your face, but it's so subtle because it's just a snarky shared glance with the person sitting next to you that you would really have to teach. So I would like to look into that. And I think I think we might want to expand our horizon. There's a couple things to think about. One is the context. This only matters if the girl that we're providing intervention for wants to hang out with other girls in her group. so we want to identify where this child wants to be socially successful. And perhaps it's useful for us to either do consider a peer mediated intervention where we can help both sides, because both people are seeing a communication breakdown and not repairing it effectively, or both sides are. Or, simply having a disability increases your likelihood of having social challenges. So there's probably not another girl with autism in a general education class. I mean, statistically, it seems unlikely, but there might be a girl with ADHD or a learning disability, and it might be more beneficial for the girl with autism if we pair her with a group of girls so they could practice having these conversations, or practice identifying shared interests where they could talk to each other, and then we can help support all the girls. We can help build up the opportunities for female social intervention groups at school.
Yeah, and so I don't know if this is a correct summation, but in listening, it sounds like the gender differences in individuals with autism isn't all that different than some of the gender differences we see overall. Are there any anomalies to that, in which, like, do girls on the spectrum actually want to be hanging out with boys more than neurotypical, or is there anything that looks different, or is it really?
So not in my research, and I want to be careful to say that I'm really speaking about my data. There is some research to say that girls' restricted interests and repetitive behaviors look different than boys, and they're more likely to look more like typically developing girls. It's just the perseverative nature of the language might be more apparent. Mm-hmm. But in my data, we looked at social network data, and we asked the question, do girls with autism and boys with autism follow typically developing trends? And we found that girls and boys with autism were more likely to nominate as friends same-sex students in their classroom. They were more likely to receive friend nominations from same-sex students in their classroom, and they were more likely to be significantly connected. So they were more likely to be significantly connected on a social network map with same-sex students in their classroom. So according to that study, girls like to hang out with girls and boys like to hang out with boys. And we know that sex is a very powerful organizer of social relationships, starting in preschool and persisting all the way through adolescence. But I know it's been a long time since we've all been at dinner parties, but when I go to dinner parties, the women are in one room and the men are in the other. So it is, a powerful way that people organize themselves socially. So I feel like it's something that we should at least keep in mind as we're thinking about how we're going to support kids socially at school.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and again, thinking about running social skills groups, so often when it is predominantly boys and there's fewer girls, then we're asking them to practice social skills with peers that they wouldn't necessarily be drawn to. So it's a little bit harder to bridge that gap. So I think for me, it's really helpful to be mindful of that, because as you're saying, I often think when I'm in social gatherings, like, I haven't progressed much since my first 6th grade dance where we went to opposite ends of the gym. Like, we still really do the same things, and the way that we socialize is just so different. So I appreciate knowing that, and that it's very similar to the development of typical individuals. So do you feel like, in looking at all of that they're actually, they say there's 4-to-1 boys to girls. Do you think that that's an accurate number if you were to speculate, or do you feel like the camouflaging really leads to an underdiagnosis? And with that, just kind of a part 2 to that question is, do you have tips then to our audience about how they could put their investigator hat on more to not miss some of the signs that an individual might be on the spectrum that's a girl?
Well, the tricky thing about averages is that they're averages. So that we say 4-to-1, but that's not consistent across the spectrum. So if you look at the range with individuals with autism who have comorbid cognitive impairment, it's a smaller ratio. And when we look at the range of individuals with autism who are average or above average intelligence, the ratio is really about 8-to-1, with 8 boys being diagnosed to 1 girl. So we do have a male bias in our perception of autism, and that is because data sets are predominantly with male participants. It's harder to find girls with autism. And even in my research, I had to aggregate data from multiple studies that were using the same measures. And I started with girls, and then I matched boys to the girls because I wanted to get a big enough pool of girls. So I would say, though, based on my research, is that it's relatively, based on the data that I reviewed, it was relatively easy to detect the social challenges of boys because they were alone. Because typically developing boys tend to be involved, mutually engaged in a game with rules for the duration of recess, or for a majority, some sort of organized, structured activity. So if you're having social challenges, they can be identified because you're a boy and you're not playing the game.
Yeah.
Or you're by yourself wandering the periphery of the playground, or you're sitting next to a paraprofessional. Girls, it's very subtle. If I was a playground attendant and I was scanning the playground, I would actually think girls with autism look amazing because they look like the other girls. It's not until I get really close in and start listening to the interactions that I see that there's actually a breakdown in communication, or worse, something that could feel like, to the girl with autism, bullying or rejection. And so really we have to think about proximity and getting in there. So we're seeing, is this girl really mutually engaged in activity? For example, one of the girls I observed on the playground, she was involved in a jump rope game, and she was swinging the jump rope, and everyone else got a turn, but she was never given a turn. So if I was just scanning the playground, I might think, great, she's involved. She's mutually involved in a game with rules, playing a game. But she wasn't mutually involved because she was never given a turn, and she never asked for a turn. So we need to look more closely at girls with autism, because it's, the scanning that does appear to be appropriate for boys is not where we could miss something with girls.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. In addition to all this research that you do, you also, you have a few other things going on too. We already heard about your consultation work, but you're a teacher too at Channel Island. So can you tell us about the courses that you teach, or maybe just about your favorite course that you teach and why you like teaching that class?
Okay, I teach a class. I think I've got 3 favorite classes. I teach a class called Educational Research, which I love, and it is a class for teachers who are coming back to get their master's degree, but they don't have research experience. So it's really, this is how to be a consumer of research. So I really enjoy providing access to, this is how you consume research. This is how you can identify evidence-based practices to put in your classroom, and use that to inform the way you teach. And another reason why I really like it is because I tend to have a large majority of my students who are first-generation college students, so they don't have a strong academic background coming in. So it feels very rewarding to identify students' potential and really shape them and mold them, because it is the first class I take in their master's degree. And I love giving them a strong foundation to move them through the rest of their program, which tends to be heavy with reading and heavy with writing. And then I also teach a prerequisite class to the credential program, but it is for general education, single subject students. So people who want to become middle school or high school teachers. And the class focuses on classroom management, but I love it because this is where I get to train general education teachers to think about disability, best practices for classroom management. I can talk to them about evidence-based practices for students with autism and students with other disabilities, and they might not ever get this in their program without me sort of taking over this class and teaching directly to how do you support all students in your classroom?
Right.
And you will not have a classroom without a student with a disability. So let's be very conscientious about how we can support these students in your class successfully.
Well, what a gift for both of those. I was thinking, I would have loved, like, very early on in my career for somebody to say, okay, if you want to implement something, like, here's how you find something, here's how you vet it, and then figure out if it applies to your classroom. And then I think many of us also support students in general education environments. And often I find myself like, I wish in these programs there was training on how to support just neurodiverse individuals. So that's really great that that's happening in those programs as teachers are coming out. Can you share a little bit about your personal life? I know you have a son. Can you talk a little bit about him, and then how being the mom of him has influenced your work, and also just how you see your work and the value of what you do?
Well, I have a son who was born deaf in his right ear, and if you were born deaf in your right ear, that's more significant than being born deaf in your left ear because of the language pathway. So just by the nature of how he was born, he also has auditory processing deficits, has later been diagnosed with ADHD, and that's been not without challenges during a pandemic and at-home learning. But most importantly, I think I've noticed that when he sees someone on TV, or when Disney has a character with a cochlear implant, or a hearing aid is shown, or now we watched Godzilla versus King Kong, and the actress from Stranger Things, what's her name, Millie Bobby Brown, is also deaf, hard of hearing in one ear. I could point that out, and he identifies with that, and that's really important to him to see people with hearing loss represented on TV. Mark Ruffalo, the conductor from Hamilton, also is hard of hearing, and so that's, circling back to the work on autistic representations on television. I think it's really important that we have authentic representations because it matters to people. And I think about my 7-year-old son who knows, by the nature of having a disability, he knows he has a disability. And so he wants to feel accepted for who he is. And when he sees people like him on TV, that does help him relate and feel valued. And so I think that's important that we recognize the power of representations. Also, it's important that we recognize the power of representations when they are representing stereotypes or inaccurate. That's
Great.
Also helpful too. And so, I think a lot about him because he goes to a school that has an NPS, a non-public school for kids who are deaf, hard of hearing. So he's one of 5 kids in his class who wears a hearing aid, or other kids wear cochlear implants. And it's just the norm in the school. So he has deaf friends and he has hearing friends, and he feels very lucky to be one of the deaf kids because he has these deaf friends. And I want to see that individuals with autism, individuals with neurodiversity of any kind, can feel proud of who they are because they've got gifts and things to contribute. And we're so often focused on this deficit model, and this is just the medicalized language, that we forget that there's so many wonderful things about people. And it's just really empowering. So to see that my son can just quickly say, I have my deaf friends and I have my hearing friends, but no one cares, honestly, because they've all been trained. So I'd like to see us go that direction in general education classrooms, where we can take some of the stigma away and we can teach everyone. And this goes back to my idea that we need to teach peers as much as we need to teach kids with autism, because maybe this person with autism will always talk like someone who has autism, and that should be great. And let's learn how to talk with them too, and honor the gifts, because I'm sure you feel this way. I think about students that I've worked with students with autism that I've worked with, and my life is so much better because I've known them and I've had such rich, meaningful experiences. And I hope that we can start moving in the direction that we just value neurodiversity for what it is. It's different. It's amazing.
Right. Absolutely. And I know you mentioned last time we were talking too that Dave Pilkey also came out recently that, right, he has a diagnosis of
yeah. Dave Pilkey is an advocate, is a self-advocate, but he has an ADHD and a dyslexia diagnosis. And that means a lot to my son too, to identify with someone who he really respects as for his style of humor and also his artwork.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
he can identify with someone who is quite successful and artistic and thinks differently, and that's okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I know this isn't the topic of today, but I think that makes me curious about areas of research related to that. That as we can present more individuals, more diverse individuals in writing books and TV shows, all those different areas, if it would help us to be more inclusive and understand that that's a great thing to be celebrated. And I think like we're almost to the end of our hour, but and thinking about that, I'm reflecting that throughout your career, really throughout your life, Michelle, there's a theme of inspired work related to social justice and really valuing inclusion. So as you are moving forward in your career and in your life, what do you predict? How do you think that this will, what's exciting for you to think about what might be next and what's on your horizon for research?
That's a big question.
I know there was kind of three in there.
Well, right now I'm just starting. I just got IRB approval. So I've been working with community stakeholders within Los Angeles and autistic self-advocates. But I'm starting a study where I'm interviewing professional actors with autism about their experience playing characters with autism.
Oh, wow.
Film and television. And it's been really humbling and amazing to talk with people who are in the entertainment industry to get their feedback on the study. So that I'm very interested in. I will see how individuals with autism identify and what they like about current representations and about their experience with if you are having to disclose your autism diagnosis in order to get some of these roles. So we'll see how that goes. And then I am really excited about schools opening up again because I would very much like to be walking around school campuses and working with kids in schools. And I think with so many kids and children feeling isolated in these Zoom worlds, I think social skills interventions are going to be really important once schools officially open up and we can start walking on school campuses again. So that's definitely a plan for my future, is to go back and start walking around and talking to kids on high school and elementary school campuses.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems like a great window of opportunity. I think many of us working in schools anticipate that as students are returning after a year of being home, we're going to see a definite need for some social skills support and social anxiety as well. So that seems like a good time to be able to say it's not just these individuals with these identified areas, but how can we support everybody?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, well, with one more thing, I'm thinking back to Atypical because I shared with you earlier, I started to watch it again this week to get ready for today. So I was just curious, what's your favorite episode on that show and why, and what was your involvement with it, if any?
I wish I had this question before.
Sorry.
I guess I'll just talk about sort of a theme throughout. Sam has this really wacky friend, Zahid, and Zahid is over the top, and I think he's funny and he says funny things, but he also models how to be a friend of someone with autism. And I really love that about his character because he just accepts Sam for who he is, and he just models this is how I can be friends with someone with autism. And actually, there was a faculty at Channel Islands where I work, and her teenage daughter watches Atypical, and she said, "Oh, I never really realized that I could be friends with the kids with autism at my school, but now I realize that I can be friends with the kid with autism at my school." So it's interesting to watch how these representations also provide exposure to, oh yeah, we can have these mutual relationships. And we also have to think about what kind of practices are we having at school where we feel like we're separating, where the typically developing kids feel separated from or different. And I don't know the answer to this question, but I want to ask it. Are we doing something to reinforce sort of this invisible line in between, and how can shows or these types of representations help neutralize that?
For sure. Well, thank you so much for your time, Michelle. I personally, and I shared this with you before, I authentically mean, I feel really inspired listening to your story, and just really struck by not only your research and how helpful it is to us as practitioners to be thinking about it, but also your deep rooted desire to address the needs of those who are underserved, and to support inclusivity. So thank you for your work. Thank you for your time. And we are excited to see what comes next from you. So keep us posted.
Thank you for having me. This is fun.
Of course. Bye.